you wanted the best, you've got the best podcast. The hottest podcast in the world. The Chris Voss Show, the preeminent podcast with guests so smart you may experience serious brain bleed. The CEOs, authors, thought leaders, visionaries, and motivators. Get ready. Strap yourself in. Keep your hands, arms, and legs inside the vehicle at all times, because you're about to go on a monster education roller coaster with your brain. Now, here's your host, Chris Voss.
Hi, folks. It's Voss here from thechrisvossshow.com. There you go, ladies and gentlemen. There, lady sings it. That makes it official. I'm so glad after 16 years I don't have to sing that bit anymore, and we hired somebody to do it. Welcome to the big show. We, of course, have the most smartest people on the show, and we're going to be talking about artificial intelligence. We're going to be talking about Cold War 2.0, according to the author that we have on today, and all that great stuff. But in the meantime, refer the show to your family, friends, and relatives. Go to goodreads.com/Chris Voss, linkedin.com/Chris Voss, Chris Voss 1 on the Tickety-Tockety and all those crazy places on the internet. He is the author of the new book that just came out March 5th, 2024. It's entitled Cold War 2.0, Artificial Intelligence in the New Battle Between China, Russia, and America. George Takash joins us on the show with us today. He'll be talking to us about his amazing book. Everyone's talking about, oh my gosh, every day we've been dealing with some of the most interesting elements that are developing in our world, and AI, of course, is advancing at a pace that's totally crazy, and we're going to get into it with him and all the stuff that he does. He holds a bachelor degree in history, political economy, and philosophy from the University of Toronto, a graduate degree from the Norman Patterson School of International Affairs at Carleton University, and a law degree from the University of Toronto. For 40 years, he's practiced technology law at McCarthy Tetrault? I'm bad on my France. There you go. Canadian's premier law firm. He's written 3 books on technology, law, tech, commercial subjects. This is his first book for a general audience. And he also lives, who knew, in Toronto, Canada. Welcome to the show, George. How are you?
I'm great. I'm really happy to be on with you, Chris.
We're really happy to have you as well, from the Great Wide North up there, eh? So give us your .coms. Where can people find you on the interwebs?
Actually, I'd really like you to just find the book at simonschuster.com. That would be great. But if anybody wants to get a hold of me to either agree with me or to take some exception to what I say, just georgetakash@gmail.com is fine.
There you go. So give us a 30,000 overview, if you would, of your new book, Cold War 2.0.
So the Cold War part is, plainly speaking, because the autocracies of the world, led by China and Russia, have dragged the democracies of the world, led by the United States, Western Europe, they've dragged the democracies into another Cold War. And the reason they do that is because they just don't want to comply with the rules anymore. And, I was thinking, I'm a big Blue Jays baseball fan. And it's like if you started, the season and the first batter from the other team up to the plate brought an aluminum bat. and you ran out onto the field and said, well, hold it. You know the rules. You got to have a wooden bat. And the guy says, nah, I'm not playing by those rules. And then when your manager turns to the ump and says, hey, come on, call it on these guys, the ump takes off his mask, and isn't he the other team's manager's brother? So this is what's going on with the autocracies.
There you go.
Specifically Russia, Vladimir Putin, autocrat number 1, invading Ukraine, 2014, takes over Crimea, when 20 years ago, Russia signed a treaty that said this land is specifically going to be part of Ukraine. So again, they don't care about treaties. They don't care about agreements. They rip them up. And then more recently, China is getting into the act. The South China Sea, huge body of water. And we have rules for how you figure out maritime rights and the way you draw those maritime boundaries. China comes in and says, nah, not interested in those rules. I'm just claiming 90% of this water for myself. And that has huge implications for international trade and oil discovery, and so on. And then the last one that put me over the top and actually, made me write the book was China's approach to Taiwan. Here's a country, 24 million people, but technologically, Chris, absolutely critical, and we'll get into that. Mm-hmm. And China says, no, I think I'm going to absorb Taiwan, thanks very much, even though the Chinese Communist Party has never ruled, has never been, the government of Taiwan, and nobody in Taiwan literally wants to be a part of China. Mm-hmm. So this is the Cold War. And unfortunately, that's the bad news. For those of us of a certain age, we remember the first Cold War, and it wasn't a happy time. But the better news is, and this is the 2.0 part of the title, is that technology is going to be a critical factor in the outcome of this Cold War. And as you alluded to in your opening, AI is going to be part of everything. Mm-hmm. So the four technologies that I look at, AI is obviously center stage, but I also look at semiconductor chips because the high-end ones are what you need to run AI. So that's really important. And again, we'll get into some more details, I'm sure. And then quantum computing, which is a new type of computing that many of your listeners might not be aware of, but it's coming on gangbusters. And it actually may be sort of the wild card in this whole technology play. And then finally, biotech, because we're also using technology to change people. Our very evolution is being sort of turned upside down. So those are the four biggies that the book looks at and figures out, okay, how's that going to work with this Cold War rivalry? Mm-hmm. And the good news, and I'll end on this, the great news is the democracies do innovation and do technology and do these four technologies way better than the autocracies. So as long as we hang together as a bunch of democracies around the world, we're going to do okay. But that's not an easy trick to do.
Definitely. I mean, we're seeing, we're seeing the fallback in, pending what we have with the election coming up. I mean, if Trump were to win, we'd see probably a closing off we'd see an isolationism or a nationalism of our policies. We probably would. I was watching Mitt Romney talk about how we would probably lose our place as a leader in the world. And already European countries are just aghast that he could come to power and that we could become more nationalist, and his attitudes towards NATO, and already we're seeing the House, which is Republican held, won't fund Ukraine anymore, and it's almost like watching them. It's almost like watching the British government that was like, no, go ahead and sell airplane parts and engine parts to Germany. What could go wrong? It's almost like that, just 2.0, watching it again. So when did the Cold War 2.0 start, according to your timeline?
Can I pick up on your comment a minute ago? Because actually, it's bang on. And the example I'm going to use is semiconductor chip technology, which semiconductor chips, they're tiny, mm-hmm. but they're actually the most important device that humans make nowadays, because anything around you, on you, your smartphone, your watch, your car, if you're in the military, your missiles, your tanks, everything contains these tiny, tiny semiconductor chips. And frankly, they're really hard to make. And the United States is great at designing them. You've probably followed NVIDIA recently. They are knocking it out of the park, to use another baseball analogy, because they're making the chips that run AI. But AMD is right up there as well, another American company. Apple makes its own chips. So those chips are designed in California, but, and here's the big but, they're actually manufactured in Taiwan by a company called TSMC, Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Corporation. But here's the other thing. TSMC in Taiwan, the big machine that it uses to make those chips actually is made in Little Netherlands in Europe. Oh, wow. Of all places. It's the most complex machine in the world. Each one costs about 500 million bucks US. And the two most important components of that machine, speaking of Germany, are actually made in Germany. The laser that has to hit a little bit of tin and vaporize it 50,000 times a second. The whole thing, Chris, just boggles the mind, right? These chips, the smallest ones are holding now 100 billion transistors. It's just over the top. So the point I would make to you, to follow on your point, which is, as I say, bang on, is that nobody can do technology in 2024 all alone. It's just not on. It's just so complex, and there's so many pieces. And the Japanese are in there with the chips. They make the underlying silicon wafers and the gases that are used. Yeah, so it just goes on and on and on. So I'm with you 100%. And the book talks at some length about, yeah, we're leaders in the technology, but unless we have strong alliances where all the democracies agree to kind of cover each other's backs, you know, it's going to be a much harder trip for everyone. So I'm with you. Whoever comes out of the November election in the U.S., both the president and, you know, the legislative races, they just can't turn their back on the world. And not just for the sake of Europe and Japan and so on, but for the sake of the United States.
Yeah.
Because if these chips don't show up in your supply chains, your cars aren't working, your machines aren't working, your trains aren't working. And we had a little taste of it, right? A couple of years ago, coming out of COVID, some of the chip supply problems.
Chains. I had a lot of companies we review products on at the Chris Voss Show. They couldn't get the chips for their products to sell.
Bingo. So that was like child's play compared to what's going to happen if the Chinese move on Taiwan and we're not, if the democracies aren't there to protect them. Absolutely.
There you go. Now, recently, I think a year or two ago, but the Biden administration put a clamp down on the chip thing. I was really surprised by that. Tell us your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think, you know, when I considered 2022 and what happened in the international sphere of real importance, two things happened. Putin and the Russians invaded Ukraine on a full-scale mode. That was in February. But in October of 2022, again, you're bang on, Chris, the Biden administration brought in a very sweeping law that said chips of a certain performance level, I won't get into all the technical details, but basically the high-end chips and the machines that make them, to my earlier point, those can no longer be sold to China. And this is huge. And frankly, the Chinese are up in arms because they import and used to import, you know, hundreds of billions of dollars worth of this stuff. And without it, you know, your military becomes second class, your economy becomes second class. And so what Biden's doing, and it makes so much sense, is, hey, in the democracies, we shouldn't give the autocrats the rope with which to hang us. That would be madness. And so, you know, kudos to Biden. Now, to be fair, Trump started a bunch of that as well during his 4 years. But Biden made it much more sort of broadly effective. And it's not just the chips, again. It's without those chips, you can't do the leading edge AI. And right now, you know, the democracies are probably 5 to 7 years ahead of the Chinese on AI. And AI is going to be the defining technology of this century. So really important stuff.
Yeah, and whoever leads AI, I think, wins. Wasn't it Putin that said something like that? Was it?
Yeah, I have a quote in the book from Putin. He's talking to some high school kids, and he says exactly your phrase. He says, you know, this AI race is going to be critical, and whoever leads an AI can, you know, rule the world. What's fascinating, though, and just let me take a minute on this, because particularly people in your audience who work as engineers or in the science fields and so on, the way that the democracies do science and do technology and do innovation, sort of ground up, you kind of back an entrepreneur, you back a university professor with a spin-out company, you bring in venture capital, maybe private equity, and then you take them public. That model, which doesn't exist in the autocracies, is golden. Like the Silicon Valley model for moving us forward. And there's a thing I call, and I spent a little bit of time on this in one of the chapters, called competitive displacement. Now, do you remember when the Sony Walkman, the Discman was all the rage, and then along came the iPod? And I was almost in tears with the iPod. It was so small, it didn't skip when you jogged with it, and you could navigate your playlist and so on. So that's competitive displacement. The iPod, within 7 months, Discmen were like decimated. And that's frankly the beauty of the free market system working, within a democratic environment. In the autocracies, the problem for them is that the autocrat, so Putin in Russia, Xi Jinping in China, they pick one winner, the Discman, and then they ride it. And when along comes the iPod, they say, no, we're going with the Discman. In the case of Putin, it's because he gets probably, 15% off the top. So he's lining his own pockets. And so our ability to create new tech, new innovation is really second to none. And so if we can blend that in with this none of us is as strong as all of us approach to the world, will prevail in Cold War II, just as we actually prevailed in Cold War I.
Let's hope so. It's the importance of those ideas. And this is very topical. Just this morning, it came out across the wire that China has announced it's phasing out AMD Intel chips from government computers, according to the Financial Times. And they're basically trying to force their own systems to make up for these things and develop their own sort of chip thing. I know, it seems like I read something a few days ago, too, that they're actually trying to move away from the OS. I think they're not going to use Microsoft and other OSs as well. Talk to us about that if you're familiar with the latest news on that.
Yeah, so the last chapter of my book talks about a technology decoupling. So I'm not talking about 100% of the merchandise from China that you find in a Walmart. You'll still get your shower curtains, and some of your ceramic plates and all that. You'll get that from China, for as long as there's no war between China and the democracies. But what you'll see more and more and more of is this decoupling on the technology side. So exactly what you said, in response to the Biden policy of prohibiting chips and chip-making equipment from going over to China, China has reciprocated, but very gingerly, actually, because they're shooting themselves in the foot every time they say no more Intel or no more AMD and so on and so forth. The interesting decoupling, though, Chris, that's going to be fascinating to watch is TikTok. Because TikTok is owned by a Chinese company. If you go on TikTok, and TikTok, by the way, has 170 million users in the United States. So this is a big app. It's really given, YouTube, short reels, and so on, Instagram, a run for the money. But frankly, if you go on TikTok and look at the videos that are there, a lot of them are put there by the Chinese government, and they're just blatant propaganda. So it's that problem, plus the Chinese government doesn't really allow a private sector to be private. Everybody in China has to kowtow to Beijing. So if they want to find out about Chris Voss because he's on TikTok, guess what? They get to look at your preferences, what sort of stuff you like, so that they can start feeding even more specific propaganda into, Chris Voss's feed. So the House of Representatives a week or so ago passed a bill that would require TikTok to either be divested to sort of a non-Chinese owner or shut down. And I think that's absolutely the right, decision to make. And it's really just tit for tat because you can't get Google, you can't get Facebook, you can't get Instagram in China. So this decoupling is going to happen. Mm-hmm. And what I predict in the book is that over time, our technology and our technology environment is simply going to be more, is going to be superior to theirs. Mm-hmm. And at some point, I'm hoping that the way the Soviet Union fell apart, China will ultimately, the people will rise up and say, look, this is madness. They've got a cure for cancer over in the United States and we don't get access to it and so on. Mm-hmm. And that in 30, 40 years time may well bring a regime change in China to something, more like a democracy.
Yeah, and let's get into that. You mentioned about how they put their thumb on the scale and they don't allow private industry to thrive. We saw that, but most people were seeing it that knew what was going on was China was cheating their GDP numbers by building just crazy, housing and commercial centers, and they're building whole cities that were sitting empty, and everyone knew they were cheating their GDP to make it seem like there's a lot of growth happening, and they've hit two walls. One is they're generationally declining now. So they're starting to enter what like Japan has been going through with their population, and that one-child policy definitely really screwed the pooch on them for all the years they were doing it. And then recently, and you may not have been able to address this in the book, because I know a lot of times you guys have to go to publish about a year before. There's the collapse of the housing market, which they kept putting their thumb on to discourage private enterprise and try and control it. And they end up just botching the whole thing. And now the stock market has lost, what, $6 to $8 trillion or something like that. They're trying to patch the hole on. How do you see that playing into what you talked about in the book, since that's probably newer news?
Yeah, in the chapter that I talk about China, I do talk about the menacing part, because everything, again, Chris, you're way up to date. Everything you said is bang on. But set against what you just said, you also have to add, we've seen from China the biggest military buildup in human history. Even with all the economic difficulties that they currently have, they're still increasing their defense budget next year by 7.2%.
Yeah.
They currently have the largest navy in the world by number of vessels. Now, the U.S. is still ahead in terms of raw tonnage, because the Americans have the huge aircraft carriers. They're building nuclear missiles at a frantic pace. So even with their economic troubles, they're doubling down on the military. But to your point, in that chapter, I do talk about the difficulties that China's having, particularly on the economic side. And the one that I think is one to really keep a sharp eye on is the population collapse.
Yeah.
I mean, you mentioned the one-child policy. What a mistake that was. You need 2.1 children for a couple to get to, replacement numbers, because some kids die, so that's the 0.1. Mm-hmm. And they're at about 1.3. And by the end of the century, they could be at something like 550 million from 1.4 billion. Like it's an amazing decline. Which is why in the book, in the biotechnology chapter, and this is the only time in the book that I talk speculatively. The stuff that I'm saying about AI and quantum computing and the chips, that's today. That's not, science fiction 2050. That's here and now. But the one that I think is one to, as I say, keep an eye on, and you heard it here first on the Chris Voss Show, ectogenesis, an artificial uterus, where if the Chinese government can't convince women to have babies, there's two ways to go. There's Margaret Atwood's A Handmaid's Tale, if you remember.
Yeah.
It was made into the movie, the television series, and so on. But the other approach is the government simply starts making people itself. And I talk in the book that we actually have all the pieces It was actually a medical practitioner scientist in Philadelphia a couple of years ago that built such a device for lambs, so still for animals, but it kept the animals alive, as it were, as they were gestating. So don't discount that sort of a response, because that kind of a population decline is so drastic that if you're Xi Jinping and ultimately, you want to be one of the two big superpowers in the world, I wouldn't be surprised if he turned to something like that. And what I say in the book is we certainly don't want to participate in any of that. To your point, we have to cut off, any flow of our biotech capability to China when they start mucking around with that stuff. Now, interestingly, we might pick it up as well. Our birth rates are dropping pretty dramatically as well. South Korea is down to 0.8. Like it's really like all over the world. But the way the autocrats will deal with it is just scary.
Yeah. I was listening to, I don't know if you followed his stuff, Peter Zahon. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that correctly. He wrote the books The Accidental Superpower and The End of the World is Just Beginning. And he was on Sam Harris's show. And he was talking about the generational decline and some of the factors you're talking about. He was saying Germany's going to pretty much cease to exist as a country with their generational declines. Everyone's declining, and of course we have these huge populations that are going into the with the boomers and the big retirement generation. But the brain drain that comes from that, the ability to come up with new ideas, new possibilities, he seemed to suggest that America has the best lead on that, but Europe, of course, will be in a future danger. I think I was reading in Europe. I think it's in Britain. Basically, I think 50% of the women of childbearing age over 30 are single, which means they don't have good prospects to have families and kids. They're single with no kids. And that's like half the population. And we're already seeing that here in America, where people aren't making families. They can't afford to buy houses. There's a whole set of cards that play into that. But so it sounds like you've done some factors where there's measurements that you're using on population growth that you've talked about in your book and how that impacts this whole thing. Yeah.
So a couple of those. So Peter Zahon, I've heard him actually on Sam Harris. He's been on a couple of times. He does sort of geopolitical risk analysis and that sort of thing. What's very interesting on the population decline phenomena, is you can counter it with immigration. And I talk about this in the book because, again, the autocrats don't do immigration well at all. Today, of course, nobody wants to go to Russia. And even China, they're just not good at allowing, non-Han Chinese to become part of their society. And last year, the stats are in, 24,000 Chinese actually, escaped from China and came up through the Darien Gap, up through Central America and that sort of thing. Whereas when you look at, for instance, the United States, NVIDIA, the hottest AI company in the world right now on the chip side, Jensen Huang, born outside of the United States. The president of Microsoft, born outside of the United States. Google, born outside the United States. So that's a huge competitive advantage. And, we talked at the top of the show about, U.S. hopefully not shutting off the rest of the democracies for its own sake. Same thing with immigration. I mean, the U.S. has an issue at the southern border, and I'm sure you guys will get around to fixing it. But for heaven's sakes, don't lose sight of the fact that the best and the brightest in the world, particularly in the democracies, they all want to go to the U.S., to your universities, whether it's Stanford or MIT or Caltech. And you guys have done fabulously by that. And frankly, so has Canada and so has the UK. The other thing that we do much better than the autocracies is gender equality. AMD, the number 2 chip company, the CEO is female. The president of Taiwan currently is female. So again, you look at China and you look at the senior leadership groups and the senior scientists and so on, and the women in the ranks are pretty thin. So there really are some strengths to our system. So coming back to, the population decline issue, immigration is going to be a very important part of that. And again, I think our prospects are much brighter because of that.
There you go. There's the one thing that's been great America is the melting pot of people and ideas, and that's really kept us as a leader in the world. And people need to recognize how important that is. People have this kind of closed door behind them policy. There's there's all sorts of darker reasons behind why immigration is being fought over so much. The people that come to this country, even recently, not Alan Greenspan. How old am I with the Federal Reserve? The current head of the Federal Reserve, I can't come up with his name off the top of my head right now, but he recently admitted that one of the biggest factors of the economy still cooking along in GDP growth is immigration workers coming here and doing the jobs Americans don't want to do, and that's contributing to it. And a lot of people don't realize we're in a shortfall of employees with the baby boomers retiring. I think it's like 2 to 3 million shortfall of employees, and that's why wages are going up and the fight is going up over employees. And everyone's like, well, we don't want immigrants coming here. They do the jobs most people don't want. They contribute to the economy when you put them to work. And there's no, as you said, with the women working different things, diversity, et cetera, there's no monopoly on who has the good ideas. It could be anyone. The head of Google, as you mentioned, he grew up on a dirt floor in India and was born and raised in, I believe, in a poor caste. There's examples of that everywhere, and we need to realize that the importance of the numbers of people that we can have, the numbers of ideals, and then the freedom that we have where anybody can achieve and be successful. I think even NVIDIA's SEO story, didn't he say he was like parking cars or washing toilets or something at one time? And even then, they never thought NVIDIA would be a big deal. Feel free to build on that, but also play into how big, we've seen NVIDIA's stock just go through the roof recently and stuff. And it looks like they're going to be the big, important part of this AI Cold War 2.0.
Yeah, so two things. The third piece that I'll build on top of, racial diversity and then gender equality is gay rights. Tim Cook, CEO of Apple, he's gay. And if you actually shut out from your economy and your society, people of a different colored skin, women, gay people, and this is Russia to a T today, and why, 1 million people have left since the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. You're just not going to achieve because 60% of your population is defunct, right? They're not participating. They're not, to your point, they're not giving their ideas. They're not generating the next great thing in innovation and technology. So again, going back to the theme about the November elections, yes, every border needs a fence, but it also needs gates.
Yeah.
And don't forget to build your gates and to make sure that sufficient people at all stages, the graduate student from India is huge, but so is, the manual worker who comes in and who works in the hospitality industry and so on, and then moves up, and then look at their children. And how, my parents were political refugees from Hungary because they were involved in an uprising that didn't work and so on and so forth. So that's huge. And, you asked about NVIDIA. What I do in the book, and this is actually, I think, pretty funky, is in each of those 4 big tech buckets, the AI, the chips, the quantum computing, and the biotech, I actually list the leading companies in the world by market cap, so how valuable are they, and by their sales. and you'll see NVIDIA on the list and so on and so forth. But I break it out by, the democracies, the autocracies, and then there's actually a fascinating list led by India, which are sort of sitting on the fence. So they might be a democracy, sort of, in the case of India, but, they have some allegiance to Russia, some allegiance to the US, and that sort of thing. So I break them out like that, and then I give them a scoring. And in the last chapter, you'll see I kind of bring it all together. And so you can really see it black and white, the strength that the democracies have. And the phrase that I use, which isn't very elegant, but it works on the street, is we can't fritter this away. Like we can take these guys as long as, we have good, strong alliances. We tighten these sanctions, because little Armenia is buying a lot of chips all of a sudden. I mean, so we need better tools for figuring out how to stop the flow. But yeah, the NVIDIAs are there, and they're there for everyone to see. But to your point, yeah, the book is written about a year ago, and so NVIDIA, I think I had them at high $800 billion market. They're well over that now. So the paperback edition will have updates, I'm sure.
There you go. Now, recently, the Senate held hearings, I think it was in February, on the use of U.S. chips. You write about this in the book. You talked about how, Russia is making, these drones have become really important. And it still seems that in spite of all the blockades, embargoes that we put on Russia 2 years ago, they're still finding our chips in the military equipment the Russians are using against Ukraine, which I guess is still a big concern, if you want to talk about that.
Yeah, we have to do, and by we, I mean all the democracies need to do a much better job. Little chips are kind of hard because they are so small. But there was a report recently that big machine tools, like from Germany, one of the leading machine tool companies in the world, even those are still getting into Russia, for goodness sakes. And what I sometimes suggest on this sort of a topic is that the answer is actually more technology. So build into those machine tools, a drop-dead device that's either geolocated, or that once a week, it has to ping back to the factory. And if the ping is coming from the wrong building, then it shuts down. Like there are lots of ways to deal with this. And frankly, a slap on the wrist to the corporate sector for not wanting to do this badly enough, because they're losing sales. So I get it. They're going to lose some money. But hey, fellas, you got to play ball, because frankly, and this is why I wrote the book, I mean, this is really serious stuff. Like if we see Putin successful in Ukraine, if we see China successful in absorbing Taiwan, those are going to be very, very bad moments in the history of democracy. One of the things that'll happen, Chris, in my view, is about 30 countries will rush to acquire nuclear weapons.
Wow. Because
if the current global security system, which the U.S. is a huge part of, I talk about the U.S. as the indispensable democracy, and you are.
Yeah.
If you're not going to, feed weapon systems to Ukraine, not a single American has died in that war, by the way. Like this is actually a really good deal. You get to blunt Putin for 5% of your annual spend on defense, and no American is coming home in body bags. This is actually not a really good deal. But if you can't get up to that, and if you let Taiwan fall into the hands of the Chinese, if I'm Japan, if I'm South Korea, if I'm Brazil, if I'm Australia, like all these countries are going to rush to get nuclear weapons, because what North Korea has taught us is that nuclear deterrence still works. I mean, it was a big part of Cold War I. It's still a big part of Cold War II.
Yeah, and even Putin is still threatening it from time to time.
Yes.
In fact, it just came out that In 2022, the Pentagon was ready for, evidently, there was something up with Russia and putting out a dirty radioactive bomb or a small nuclear bomb in Ukraine. But you're right. I mean, I wish the American people thought about this more, because a lot of the people who are going to be voting are going to be the ones sending their sons to Ukraine. And you talked earlier in the show about how some of these important things come from different countries like Germany and places in the European bloc, or the old European bloc from Russia. And if Russia starts attacking, which they will, their original plan, they found the plans when they attacked. The original plan was to go to Moldova and start working on the other NATO policies. I mean, once they start attacking a lot of these countries, they're in NATO. We have to step in and do what we do. And then you start running into, the same sort of thing. Do we want to have something that looks like World War II, where Russia just takes frickin' Europe, and then we come in at the end. By then, what you're saying now is, if we lose these chip manufacturers, these machine buildings, and all this other stuff, we're in hot water. And imagine these sort of things are harder to track, like you've talked about, than arms. It used to be we had to worry about, okay, who's shipping a bunch of AK-47s to, Afghanistan. Now with these chips, you've got chips moving around the world. You've got these machines and stuff running around the world. There must be much harder to track.
Yeah, they're harder to track. The autocrats are getting smarter, so they set up hundreds of dummy corporations, all over the world. One of the things we need to do better is actually use AI to stop this evasion and getting around the rules. The other thing, and you might smile at this, every year I take my wife to the Canadian National Exhibition. It's like a big state fair, and one of the games on the midway is called whack-a-mole. And I don't know if you know this game, but you get a mallet and you have to, bonk on the head a little mole as it sticks its head up, but every time you hit one down, another one pops up, and hence it's whack-a-mole. And some people have said, oh, it's so hard to control the export of these technologies, it's like whack-a-mole. And I say, it is whack-a-mole, and we have to get really good at playing whack-a-mole. And you can get good. And Gina Raimondo, who's your Commerce Secretary, she's actually like tier one. She gets it. She's working her team really hard on it. But it is hard, and but it's for the long run. Like, shutting out Russia is not going to just be a couple more years. I think we're talking the first Cold War took 40 years to resolve. So we've got to get better at this, because our tech is so valuable. But, I'll end on this in terms of the leakage. It came out last year. The two British scientists were working with their counterparts in Iran, and get this, Chris, they were working on drone navigation systems, for goodness sakes. Wow. These are the drones that the Russians were buying to fly into Ukraine. Like, everybody's got to do their part, including the academic institutions, that, no more R&D joint venturing with China, Russia, Iran, North Korea.
Yeah, that's just insane. That's insane. And, they're the ones, Iran is the one who's providing the drones to Russia. The recent fuel purchases by India gave Russia just a huge shot in the arm, money-wise, buying their cheap oil. It's just insane. And when you see we're not funding Ukraine, and you understand what's going on in Ukraine, if anything, just holding the line, bleeding Russia out. I saw a recent picture someone posted of all the ships that Russia runs in their navy, and how many of them have been taken out by Ukraine. It's extraordinary. And then, the amount of tanks, they've bled out and depleted Russia, and then probably as well as lives, a lot. And so we have to hold the line there. If Russia, if the way a lot of people see it, he's trying to reconstruct the USSR, and there's a blockade there, a land blockade that they try and take and do. And part of what they're trying to do is is change Russia from just being a glorified gas station with resources into having other abilities to grow as a country, because I think they're in a decline too for birth, and then of course people who probably left the country for the Ukraine war, so they've got their own mind suck.
And Chris, with Russia, it's Ukraine for sure, but it's also the US and Canada and Western Europe. All those cyber attacks, all those ransomware attacks, which they're now targeting hospitals on, which is absolutely disgusting. You had the big Colonial Pipeline takeout on the cyber side, where people were, lining up for gasoline a couple of years ago on the East Coast, because again, Russia, both its own government, but also they have, private criminal groups that they condone and they put up with. And Putin's deal is, as long as they don't attack, Russian companies and Russian organizations, they can attack the democracies as much as they want. And again, I don't know this for a fact, but I'm sure Putin gets a cut. And again, we've got to stand up to Putin on this sort of behavior. And one of the recommendations in my book, and again, it's going to be controversial, is with adequate notice, right, in advance, we've got to say the ransomware has to stop, the cyber attacks have to stop, and if they don't, we're going to shut down your internet for 20, 30 minutes to begin, and we'll escalate, because we don't want to shut down their hospitals, because that's what autocrats do, and we have to stay as freedom-loving democracies. But we absolutely have to hit back. And you folks in the Pentagon, you created a cyber command a few years ago specifically to do this sort of thing. And I think if the NATO alliance, possibly at the UN as well, we get a consensus that this long distance attack through cyber, through the internet, if it doesn't stop, we've got to ratchet up the response. And we can do it. We just need political will and people. And this is why I wrote the book. Bottom line is, the average American who reads, who listens, who's interested in this stuff has to at some point send an email or a note, or when he meets his congressman, during the election campaign, say, by the way, we have to be more muscular. And here's George's book that tells you how to do it. That's what we need now, because these autocrats have had, the run of the board so far, and we need to push back.
Yeah, even them buying our politicians and floating their dirty money. And so it's a real interesting world crisis that we're living in, and it almost seems like a repeat of everything. So I'm glad you wrote about this. I'm glad you called it out, and maybe the realization is we really need to think we are in the 2.0 Cold War, and we really just need to call it that and address it. Then give us your final thoughts, George, as we go out. Tell people where they can order the book, et cetera, et cetera.
It's in all leading bookstores, but you can also get it online, Amazon, Simon Schuster, Kobo, depending on what you loot. It's in indie bookstores now as well, so it's pretty easy to get a hold of. And as I said at the top of the show, George Takash, so GeorgeTakach @gmail.com. If you have questions, comments, you want me to come and speak to your Rotary group about these sorts of things or what have you, I'd be delighted to do that.
There you go. Thank you very much, George, for coming on the show. We really appreciate it.
Thanks, Chris. Real pleasure.
There you go. Order up the book, folks, wherever fine books are sold. It's called Cold War 2.0, Artificial Intelligence, the New Battle Between China, Russia, and America, out March 5th, 2024. Thanks for tuning in, everyone. Be good to each other. Stay safe, and we'll see you guys next time.